All right, we still have a few people trickling in. Thank you so much for being here at our Common Read event. Our Common Read novel for this year is Before We Were Yours by Lisa Wingate. We have a very special guest here this morning who will shed so much more light on that story because she has lived much of that story. Before I introduce her, I'd first like to just thank the Common Read Committee who has put a lot of work into this event, especially our chair, Melissa Landers, and LaDonna Allen, who has just done so much work to make this happen, and her passion has just really driven us. We, of course, are thankful to Dr. Johnson, who supports us through the academic department, and our president, Dr. Karlowicz. On behalf of all of them, and on behalf of our Wallace State family, I'd like to introduce you to our special guest here this morning, who I'm excited about. She just has such a delightful personality. I think she's going to engage you the way she has me for the last few minutes. When she's done giving her presentation, she is more than open to take questions, so I hope that as you're listening to her, your brain will be kind of storming around and you may have a question that you would like to ask her. We will do that at the end of her presentation. You'll see the microphones at the end of each of these aisles. If you wouldn't mind, just make your way at that point down to the microphones, and we'll just kind of toggle back and forth between them as we ask questions. So again, thank you so much for being here. I'm proud to introduce you to Sallie Brandon, who is a Huntsville native. She's been in Huntsville for 41 years, and she is one of the children who was adopted through the Tennessee Children's Home Society that Lisa Wingate explores in her novel. It was based in Memphis. Sallie is old enough to remember Georgia Tan, and she has told her story to over 40 book groups. She's appeared on the Today Show, and she has spent much of her life educating people about the stories that the novel Before We Were Yours discusses. She has been a supportive resource for several other people who are looking for or trying to unite again with their families, and all those many people who have been impacted by these stories and survivors of similar trauma. So please give a warm welcome to Miss Sallie Brandon.
Good morning. Thank you all for coming out on a cold, rainy day. What happened to fall? It just turned into winter all of a sudden. I'd like to thank the campus for doing the campus read. I talked to Lisa the other day, and she was delighted to hear that you all were reading it and hope that you enjoyed it as much as she enjoyed writing it. Lisa is a wonderful author. She's written over 40 books, and people ask me, well, how did she write this book? Well, funny thing, that's exactly what I asked her. When the book first came out and I picked it up and I read it, I immediately wrote Lisa and I said, "Are you adopted?" And she said, "No." And I said, "How did you write this story? How did you get inside the mind of an adopted child if you're not adopted?" And she said, "Well, I always do a lot of research." And she did. She went to Memphis and dug in the archives of the library, and there's a lot of things in Memphis that report on this story. But she wrote it in such a compassionate way that it spoke to a lot of people. And one by one, people started contacting Lisa and saying, "You wrote my story." And she certainly wrote mine. And so after about 6 months, she was on book tour for a long time, and I never heard from her again. And then I called her again, and I said, "Let's talk." And she said, "Well, I'm coming to Nashville in May. I'm going to speak in Nashville in Franklin at the bookstore." And I went up there and met her. And she's, like I said, she's a delightful person. And she got so interested in the stories of the people that were coming forward saying, "You wrote my story," that she put together a reunion. Now, it wasn't the first reunion that ever had been held of the Tennessee Children's Home adoptees, but the first ones were from the children adopted in the 30s. And of course, they're not around, most of them anymore. And but this is the first one that I had ever been able to go to. So I went, and I didn't know what to expect, and neither did anybody else that came, but we all came bringing our folders and our files and our memory scrapbooks that we had. And as we got to meet one another, we found out that all our backgrounds were very similar. We were all from either unwed mothers or very poor families, or just happened to be at the wrong place at the wrong time. And we met Georgia Tan. Well, I don't know if any of you all have read the book Before and After. It followed Before We Were Yours, and it is the book of the 14 members that showed up for that first reunion. We each told our story, and it's the true story of those adoptees. I'm in it. I'm Janie in the book. I'm chapter 14. If you haven't read it, you might really get inside the mind and live the life of an adopted child. Georgia Tan was born in the late 1800s. She was born in Hickory, Mississippi. Her father was a judge, and her parents adopted a little boy after she was 7 or 8 years old. I'm not sure about that number, but I think she was 7 or 8. But anyway, she wanted to be a lawyer, and her daddy said no, girls couldn't be a lawyer. So she went into social work, and she was a social worker in Mississippi for a couple of years. And I know you'll really find this hard to believe, but she was fired from that job because she was not following the legal processes of adopting children. So she went to Texas for a little bit, and then she came back to Memphis. And this was in the late 20s. There was a man that had total grip over the politics in Memphis at that time, and his name was Boss Crump, and he was a criminal, and everybody knew it. And she got in with him, and he protected her, and they had a judge working with him named Camille Kelly, and she was over the youth courts. She was responsible for making children wards of the court and placing them in I drew a blank, placing them in the children's home. So Georgia Tan would drive down the street in Memphis, and if she saw little Johnny playing out by the sidewalk and nobody around him, she'd stop the car and pick up the child, kidnap him, and take him to Camille Kelly, and they'd make that child a ward of the court. And those parents would never see that child again because they were unfit parents. Now, there was a thing in the 50s where people said they wouldn't let their children play in the front yard anymore, and that goes back to being Georgia Tan. During the 30s in the country was during the Depression era, and a lot of children were available for adoption, but they had a hard time being placed all over the country. In Boston in the late 20s and early 30s, they might place 5 children a year. Georgia Tan, for some unknown reason, and people just couldn't seem to figure this out, she was placing hundreds of children a year. When I was adopted, I was born in 1945 in Lake County, Tennessee, which is the poorest county up in the by the Arkansas-Kentucky border, up around land between the lakes. And my daddy was a sharecropper, and my mother was a stay-at-home mom. She had 3 children. I had 2 older brothers. And when I was 14 months old, my father was murdered. Well, my daddy was a sharecropper, as I said, so she couldn't stay on the place if he wasn't farming the land. She was an educated woman. You all understand about education. She'd gone to school. She'd gone 3 days. She could not read or write, never could till the day she died, never could read or write. And she tried to keep the kids a little bit. She applied for welfare, and the minute she applied for welfare, she got on Georgia Tan's radar. And Georgia Tan had feelers all over this state with social workers, doctors, everybody. And when a poor family came in view, they became a target for her. And she would get that child. The unwed mothers, a lot of times, that would go to the hospital and have the child, while they were sedated or not really clear thinking, she would sign over the rights to that child to her. And she was selling the children. We were human trafficking before human trafficking had a name. So people ask me all the time, well, what did you cost? Well, if I know you have a genealogical department here, and if you've ever worked in there, you know about censuses. In the 1940 census, they ask, how much is the value of your house? And my adoptive parents lived in Memphis in 1940, and I found where they lived and, what his income was and the value of their house. His income was $2,400 a year. Their house was valued at $4,200 a year. So fast forward 9 years, you go through the war and, times are a little bit different. They paid $1,000 for me. I had my two brothers. Each went to California. They did stay together. They went to a family there. Their parents paid $1,000 each for them. Now, I know my mother knew what was going on. She knew she was paying for the child. She went to Memphis and picked me up herself. But the brothers were sent to California, and Georgia Tan would take what we call now a red-eye flight. She would take one of her workers, would get on board a flight at midnight, flying to Memphis, from Memphis to Los Angeles. And they might take 6 babies with them. Well, babies flew for nothing. And they would get a hotel room in Los Angeles and then contact the adoptive parents. And one at a time, they'd come down and pick up the children. And when I met my brother's adoptive parents, they said that they were paying for transportation fees. So they didn't have any idea that they were buying the child. They thought they were paying fees. So she had it down as a real racket. And she was sending children all over the country. She was known as the mother of adoption. People praised her. Eleanor Roosevelt praised her because she was taking these poor children out of these destitute homes and putting them in wealthy homes. Well, is that really true? No, it's not really true. Sometimes it worked out that way, and that's wonderful for the children. Those children had wonderful opportunities. Some didn't. If you'd been Joan Crawford's child in Mommy Dearest, would you have been glad to have gone to that home? 2 of the children went there. Some of the movie stars that adopted children were June Allison and Dick Powell. Smiley Burnett, the cowboy, that you younger people may not know who some of these people are, but you can Google them. Smiley Burnett was very instrumental in teaching people around Los Angeles how to contact Georgia Tan so that they could get children from her. Well, who would go to Georgia Tan? It would be people that could not adopt legally. In many, many, many cases, they were too old to adopt. My mother was 50 when she got me. She was more like a grandmother. She was unhealthy. My adoptive father was a severe alcoholic, none of which would have qualified them to go through legal channels to get children. So you had a lot of children that went to alcoholic homes. Many, many of the adoptees that I've met, this is their case, this is their story. And it was certainly my story. Georgia Tan got, one of the people that joined her group was a Jewish attorney, Abe Waldauer from Memphis. And he told Georgia that he would help her only if she would supply Jewish families with babies. So many babies went to Jewish homes. In Lisa's book, Before We Were Yours, if you remember Queenie, we all liked Queenie. Queenie and her husband were river rats. They loved each other. They had other children. They intended when this baby was born, or the babies were born, they wanted to keep them. The daddy left the children on the other side of the riverbank and came over to Memphis because she needed to go to the hospital to have the twins. And then they were told that the twins died, and Georgia Tan took them because they were poor. and she knew they couldn't come to court and try to get their children back. Many, many, many people were told their babies died. I met a woman in Huntsville when I was giving a book presentation there not so long ago, and she came up afterwards and she said, "You know, I think I was almost a Georgetown baby." And I thought, how can you be almost a Georgetown baby? And she said, well, when I was born, my mother was 16 years old, and she was married, but they were teenagers. They still lived at home with their parents. And they brought the baby home, and the baby got sick. And so they had to take her back to the hospital, and the hospital told them that she had to stay a couple of days. And so they left her. And the next morning, the young girl got a call saying that her baby had died. Well, you all remember being 16? Think about it. How would you have taken that news? Well, this little 16-year-old girl really got upset, and she said, "I want to see my baby." And they said, "Oh, no, dear, you don't want her. You want to remember her when you had her at home. You don't want to remember her now." And she said, "Yes, I do." And so she went down to the hospital that day, and she became very, very verbal, louder and louder and louder. And finally, she had attracted so much attention that a nurse came through the back door holding her baby and saying, "We made a mistake." So she really was almost a Georgetown baby. And this woman is alive and well. I see her at the library all the time in Huntsville. So that's just one of many cases where we know that they were told their baby died and she took them. When Georgetown found out about us, my mother had gotten pregnant again. And she didn't want to, the man she was seeing wouldn't marry her because she already had 3 children. So she arranged to leave us on the courthouse steps in Tiptonville, Tennessee, and she drove off without us. I can still remember seeing her driving off in the car. And then a little while later, a big black car pulled up to the curb, and this sweet little old woman got out and said, "Come with me, children." And we did. I don't know if somebody told us that we should, but we got in the car with us, and she drove us from Tiptonville to Memphis. And when we got to Memphis, she took my brothers out of the car first. My brothers were older, 5 and 6, and my middle brother was the caretaker of the group. And he would not have let her take me out of the car. He would have been like the 16-year-old. And she knew that already, so she took them out. And I remember her saying, "Well, you'll see them later." Well, 45 years later, I found my brothers. And when I have met most of you today, the ones I met outside before you came in, you know, the first thing you do is you tell me your name, and we shake hands. And I say, "Well, I'm Sallie Brandon." "What's in your name?" Well, it turns out everything is in your name. If you don't know your birth name as an adopted child, you can't get anywhere. You have to know where you came from. And I'll tell you, as you young people are going forward, it's not always where you come from that matters. It's what you do with where you are now and where you go forward. So don't look back on your life and with regrets, whatever your life happens to be. Look forward and make something with your life. But anyway, when she took me out, I went into the home with her on Poplar Street. There's my storyboard out in the lobby. Please look at the information out there. I think you'll find it interesting. And I remember Georgetown coming in every day. She had a farm out in Mississippi. In fact, she was worth millions. And she traveled to Cuba and did some gambling and had homes all over the world. And but she appeared to the people, to the everyday people in Memphis, as this poor little lady that was doing so much good for poor children, getting them into wealthy homes where they had a chance. So keep that in mind. But every day when she would come to work, she would have her limousine drive her to Memphis and stop at a bus stop, and she'd get out of the car and get on the bus and drive to the Poplar Street address. And she'd get off about a half a block from the house with her little purse and her orthopedic shoes, and sweet little smile, and she'd walk to the house, and people would say, "Oh, there goes that sweet Miss Georgetown. Isn't she wonderful?" But those that knew her a little closer knew she was a lot less than wonderful. But she would come in the house, and we weren't allowed to make any noise when she was there. We'd either be upstairs or out in the backyard playing, but we weren't allowed to do any noise. But every so often she would have parties, and she would dress the children that were available for adoption, and they would go down in these pretty party clothes and meet prospective parents. And then sometimes those children, you never saw them again. They got adopted and they left. Well, the day it was my turn to go down, she put me in a pretty little party dress, and she came down and she said, "Go out in the backyard in the swing. The people that are going to talk to you will be out there in a few minutes." And so my mom and dad came out there, and we visited for a while. And then I left with them that day. And when you see my storyboard out there, there's a picture of me sitting on the table. That's the day I was adopted. My mother and daddy, when Georgia took me back upstairs to get ready to go, I came in with a brown paper sack. I have no idea anymore what was in that, but that's what I came in with. They changed me back into the clothes that I had come in with, which wasn't much, and left. And Mother took one look at that and said, "We're going shopping." And I've been shopping ever since. So, they took me out and had my hair cut and bought me clothes and had my picture taken. And that picture out there is actually the day I was adopted. So after I was adopted, my mother, all adoptive children are foster children for 1 year. You go into the home, and the prospective home, the foster home is what it's called, for a year. They can't finalize it for a year. Well, the interesting thing about my story is that I was adopted, I was placed in 49, and my adoption was legal in August of 1950. Georgia Tan died in September of 50, so we're the end of the line. There won't be more Georgia Tan children after this last group. There were a few that were in that year that had to get settled. But the politicians knew what she was doing, and they were just letting her get by with it. She died of cancer in 50. They knew she was going to die. She knew she was going to die. They allowed her to die. And so no one was ever prosecuted for all of the trafficking that went on. Judge Kelly was allowed to retire with full benefits. Boss Crump kept on being Boss Crump. Abe kept on being a successful attorney. Nothing was ever done. But Governor Browning had come in as governor of Tennessee that year, and he was going to shut her down. And he was getting all the ducks in a row to do it. And 4 days before they were going to shut her down, she died. So that's why nobody was ever held accountable. Governor Browning changed the laws in Tennessee at that point to declare all Tennessee children home adoptions legal, so none of them could be questioned later on. In the 20s or early 30s, Georgia Tan had a law passed in the state of Tennessee sealing all adoption records, and that happened all over the country. So children could not find their family. They could not get their records. When I was little, I used to tell my adoptive mom, right after she got me, that I remembered my mother's name was Eileen, and that she had red hair, and I could remember certain things. Well, everybody asked me, how can you remember when you're 3 years old? And usually when we're a smaller group, I have everybody close their eyes, and if you want to do that, you can. And think back to your very first memory, the very first thing you can ever think about. And I'll ask a couple of you to raise your hand and let you tell your story, if you will, briefly. Does anybody want to do that? Okay, about 2 years.
My mother had 7 kids, and I remember she brought them home. I didn't know all about that until she got home, but there was a big basket, like a laundry basket, and it was in January, so it was real cold, and there was snow on the ground, because it was in 1948.
Okay.
I saw those 2 babies, one in one direction and one in the other, wrapped up in these blankets. And I remember thinking, baby dolls.
Baby dolls. That's great. But see, you were 2, so you can remember. Let's take one more. Anybody else? Okay. Well, but that just shows you can remember. I could remember before our mother left us, I could remember her boyfriend, who I thought was my father. You know, you don't ask questions, you just remember things. And he used to just beat the stew out of me. I guess I cried. I don't know. Maybe he didn't like little girls. I was the only little girl. But it was just terrible. I mean, he just beat the stew out of me. And my middle brother would take me out in the field behind the house and say, shh, Sissy, don't let him find you. Don't let him find you. So all of my life I had been looking for that middle brother. But I thought they were twins. They were so close in age. And when you look at the pictures on the storyboard, you'll see what I mean. I always thought they were twins, but they weren't. They were 11 months apart. And so I remembered all these stories. And so I had always looked for my family, and I couldn't find them because I didn't know my name. And the records were sealed. Well, in the 1980s, there was a woman in Memphis named Denny Glad. And she got interested in trying to help the children from the Tennessee Children's Home get their records. And she went to court. She took some adoptees. One woman from Huntsville went with her. She's a teacher, was a teacher in Huntsville and very well known around town. And nobody knew she was adopted. Because adoptive children don't talk about being adopted. I know in my case, you had to know me really, really well to know I was adopted. And so she went to court with Denny and told a very heartwarming story about what it was like not to ever see anybody who looked like you. Because adoptive children never see someone that looked like them. You've got an adopted family, and you know, they look like each other, but you're always a bit of an outsider. I don't care how much you love them, how much they love you. There's always a space in your soul that's not filled. And when they opened the records at that time, it was possible for adoptees to find their families. Some few had found them before, but after they opened our records, it's possible now to write the state of Tennessee and to request your records. The way they're set up now, it's you have to request pre-1951 records because our records are held differently than just general Tennessee adoption records. And not all states have opened up their records yet. There are a lot of states that still are sealed. But, you know, luckily I volunteered one day at the Catholic Family Services in Huntsville. Well, actually I didn't volunteer. I was really working as a Kelly girl. My husband retired, and I had too much husband and a lot more hours. So I signed up to work for Kelly Girl for a while. But I didn't want to work a whole lot. I mean, I was retired, so I just wanted to do a little bit. And they sent me to Catholic Family Services. And there was a social worker there. And at lunch, she and I were having a sandwich, and I said, well, how do you like being a social worker? And she said, oh, I love it. I love placing children in homes. And I said, well, you know, I was adopted. And she said, you were? And I said, yeah. And she said, where were you adopted? And I said, in Tennessee. And she said, where? And I said, in Memphis. And she said, oh, are you one of the Georgetown babies? And I said, yes. And she said, have you found your family? And I said, no, I can't. My records are sealed, and I don't even know my name. And because when an adopted child has a birth certificate, but it's issued in your adoptive name, the facts are the same, you know, what day you were born, that kind of thing. But the parents are listed as your adoptive parents, and you have the adoptive name, so that's the only name you have. So she said, well, let me go get this for you, an address for you. And she went and got me the address, and I rushed home, and I wrote the state of Tennessee and followed the instructions. And 6 weeks later, they called me and they said, we have your records and we're mailing them to you, and we have found your mother, and she's given permission for you to know. And I thought, okay, well, I really wasn't looking for my mother because I remembered a lot of things about her, especially her driving away and leaving us. And I wasn't a big fan, but if the boys had found her, I wanted to find the boys. So I said, okay, and I would open that door and do it. So I called her, and we had a very pleasant conversation, and she invited me to come see her that week. So my husband and I got in the car, and we drove over there and met her. It was like 2 days after Christmas, and her whole family was in the room when I went in. Her third husband had 12 children, and they were all there with all their families. So you can imagine it was a large group. And it just scared me to death. And so during our conversation, I said, well, did you ever think about us at Christmas or our birthday? Did you ever wonder what happened to us? And you know, she looked me right in the face and she said, no, I never did. I never thought about you again. And I thought, oh my goodness, she gave me away again, you know. So my brother went to see her, my middle brother, when I met him, and went out to California to meet them, and the two boys and I reunited. They had gone to the one family together and been raised together, but the older brother was very, very traumatized by the whole event, and he just couldn't get over it. So he is bipolar and schizophrenic and has a lot of issues. He'd been married multiple times, been an abusive father, an abusive husband, you know, and everything. I just, when I met him, I said, how could you do that coming from where we came from? And he said, sis, I don't know. But the other brother is an interesting story. He was living in a converted school bus when I met him. Had no electricity, no running water, but just happy old boy. He'd never gotten married, just lived a life of his own, kind of was a mountain man. I said, you know, he never outgrew his Tennessee roots. He was still a hunter and a fisherman and just happy-go-lucky. Well, when I met him, it changed his whole life. Because I said, how can you not do better? You had an opportunity. You had very wealthy parents. You could have been anything you wanted to be. Why did you choose to be this? And right after I met him, he went to prison for 18 months for assault. He was very violent. But he was like a big teddy bear, too. So he wasn't somebody you were afraid of. He just had temper control. But anyway, after we got to knowing each other, he got out of prison and he went to college. He got married. He bought a house. He raised a stepson, and he joined the establishment. All he needed was somebody to believe in him and to, you know, help him and tell him it was important to do better with your life. The people that adopted me, my mother, as I said, she was 51, and she wouldn't let my daddy around me because he was an alcoholic. My parents never divorced, but they separated. She and I went to Key West, Florida to live. And when I was 11 years old, she died. She and I were very, very close. She just gave me total attention, taught me values, you know, taught me manners, taught me hospitality, taught me a lot of things that I really needed to know in life and that were important. She taught me it's not a matter of if you're going to go to college, it's a matter of where you're going to go to college. Education is the answer to your life. It's the doorway to what you're going to be for the rest of your life. And she taught me all these things, but she died when I was 11. And my father had to move to Key West because that's where I was. So he stayed there a year, and in that year, he married a woman he'd been seeing in Tennessee. And when I got out of school that school year, he sent me to Tennessee to stay with her until they got married that summer. Well, I didn't like her, and she didn't like me, and it was really ugly. But I begged Daddy not to marry her, but he did. And then they got married, and 11 months after they got married, he died with leukemia. So, I have no living relatives. I was an only child with this adoptive family. So I ended up with a stepmother who hated me, and I hated her, so I'm not giving her all the credit. It was a mutual admiration society. And it just didn't work. But I remember at 12 years old, and it's important that you remember this, sitting myself down and say, okay, where do we go from here? Do I go with this person that I can't stand and have a chance in life? Do I go back in the system and go into another orphanage? Because she was not an adoptive mother to me. She was nothing to me except my daddy's wife. Stepmother, sort of. But I decided to stay with her, and she moved us back to Tennessee. We went to Nashville, and I graduated from high school in Nashville and went to Peabody College and raised my children in Nashville. I have 2 children, a boy and a girl. And then in 1980, I moved to Huntsville, and I've been there since. But when you went into Georgia Tan's house on Poplar Street, where you were given a number, and all of the children who are searching for their family records and so forth, first thing I ask them when they get them is, what's your number? And they said, what? And I said, up in the upper left-hand corner of your documents is a 4-digit number. What is yours? Well, everywhere you read on the internet, they say that Georgia Tan was responsible for 5,000 adoptions. Well, my number was 7,581. I met a man who came from a little town in Tennessee, just over the Tennessee line from, as you're going to Chattanooga, from a little town called Whitwell. He came in right after me. I left in August. He was born in December and placed almost immediately. He was a baby. His number was 7,581. So there were like 250 children between August and December. And people are they're fascinated that their numbers on all their documents. So they know, and I know if they came in the 40s, they're going to be before me. I can tell from their number how much before me. But people call Lisa all the time saying, how can I get my records? And so she sends them to me. And all during this coronavirus, I've been working with adoptees, telling them how to get their records from Tennessee, what to expect, how long it takes, what it will cost them. Because, believe it or not, the state of Tennessee charges us $150 to give us our records. I think they owe that to us, but they don't seem to think so. But it's still a bargain to get your records, so nobody complains. Then they charge us $0.25 a page for everything that's in your file. Well, my file had 48 pages. Everything you read on the internet says Georgia Tan didn't keep records. Records are there. Unbelievable records. And in that year that you're a foster child, she encouraged the foster parents to write to her. And usually the letters are in that file, so you get to read them. But she will usually say, well, if little Johnny's outgrown some of his clothes, would you send them to me for these poor children that are in the home? And parents all over the country were sending her all these pretty little clothes that she was dressing those children in to go down for the parties. So that's where she got them. She wouldn't buy on anything. If you came in sick, she wouldn't let a doctor treat you. I came in with tonsillitis, which I had frequently through my young childhood. The way that she let the doctor treat me was I had a small glass of orange juice and a vitamin tablet. And if I died, I died. There's always more children. And there's a woman in Before and After that her chapter is something like Supposed to Die or something like that. She was in a crib when her mother and daddy came to pick up a little boy Georgia had found for her. And they handed him this little fat, happy, chubby little boy. And the mother was playing with him. And the father kept hearing this sound way, way back in the corner. And he couldn't figure out what it was. It sounded like it was an animal that was in pain. And so he kind of wandered around the nursery upstairs in the house. And he went over to where the sound was, and it was a baby in a crib. And it was drawn up like this in a lot of pain, and it was just covered with scabs and just really awful. And he looked at that child for a while, and he walked back and he said, Georgia, he said, we've changed our mind. We don't want this little boy. You've got other people that will be thrilled to get him. We want that little girl in the crib over there. And she said, oh, no, you don't want her. She's not going to live through the day. And he said, yeah, she needs us. Doesn't that just touch your heart that somebody would do that? And they took that little girl, and they took her to a pediatrician right away. And he said she had scabies, and he treated her for scabies. And he said the reason she was drawing up so bad was she was allergic to milk. And he told the parents, he said, go out in the country and get goat's milk for her twice a week and feed her only goat's milk, and she'll be fine. And he clipped her tongue because it needed clipping. And she's alive and well today. I know her very well. She lives in Memphis. But if that man hadn't been as good-hearted a person as he is, she would have died that night. In the cemetery in Memphis is a marker for the 19 children that Georgia Tan claimed died under her care. Well, it's more like 500, but they can't prove it. If they died, their body just disappeared. Who knows where they went? But it was more like 500 died in her care because she wouldn't let them be treated, or because they were neglected in some way. She would have a doctor on staff, but they would quit eventually because she wouldn't let them treat her. Well, while I was in the home, my grandfather found out that Georgia Tan had picked us up and taken us to Memphis. I went in July, and he came about 2 weeks later. So I know I was in the home the day he came. Must have been upstairs. I don't know. I didn't know he was there. But he went home and said that Georgia Tan said that we had already been adopted and he'd never see us again, and he didn't. But, I was upstairs. She wasn't going to give us back. We were a commodity to her. She didn't want us going anywhere but somewhere to earn a lot of money. But a lot of the children now that are coming forward, I'm 75 years old, and as you know, I'm the end of the line with this, so it's the children of the adoptees that are coming forward now saying, my mother was adopted, my daddy was adopted. Remember in the book Before and After, Before We Were Yours, when the little girl, the teenage girl, was looking over the fence and could see her sisters playing in the playground? Well, the daughter of those children was at the Memphis reunion. Their stories in this book. I mean, that's one that she lifted out of a newspaper article and brought it to life in the pages of a book. You all may never have the opportunity to have a book speak to you in such a strong way, but I can tell you that there are hundreds of us that book changed our life. People that didn't know that they could find these records. But when they come to me, I don't find the records for them. I don't do the search for them. I don't charge them anything, but I lead them through the path of finding it. You have the genealogy group here, the Heritage Library here. If you've never checked it out, you should really check that out because it's wonderful. when I found my family, we didn't have DNA and we didn't have ancestry, but you've got all that now. The state of Tennessee found my mothers and my brothers for me, and I'm the only one that I've found that they did that for. I don't know if I was the first one to request my records or what, but they did that. They don't do that anymore. For $150, you get your records, and you're on your own. Well, I show them how to do a DNA test while they're waiting on their records so that they have that information. I show them how to use Ancestry, and I usually, unbeknownst to them, follow their journey a little bit without telling them. So when they start telling me what they're finding, I can say, no, I don't think you're going the right way. Let's try this way and go in a different way. And sometimes if the name is like Mary Smith, it's easy to get the wrong Mary Smith and think that's your mother. So you have to be sure that you document and you verify what you're finding to be sure you get the right family and the right story. One man I worked with was 95 years old. He never wanted to know he was happy with his adoptive family. He never talked about being adopted. He didn't talk about it to his children. He rarely spoke of it to his wife. He led a full life. But his son, who is retired, read the book before we were yours. And he called Lisa, and she sent him to me, and we worked really closely for 2 years on his. And at the end of the day, I told him, I said, well, first of all, you need to go to your father and you need to say, Dad, I'm really interested and I want to get your story. If you don't want to know it, I won't make you know it, but I want to know it. And his dad loved his son, and I told him, I said, get his DNA. Don't use your DNA, use his, because you can get it. And as a result of that, Al died this March from the coronavirus, and I never got to meet him. I was always going to go when the nursing home that he was in was closed down. But I went and met his son and his siblings, and they took a bus trip, and they have met half-brothers of his father. They've connected with family members. They have the whole story. The father thought his mother didn't want him, that she'd just given him away. And the story is that his mother died in childbirth. And when you get your records and you get working in the censuses and you find out the true story of what was going on, it heals that hole in your heart that you have. And, it really does make you whole. But I've relived these stories with so many of the Jewish children. One woman whose picture's out there on the desk, there's a picture of her, and beside is a photograph of her birth mother that she looks just like. And she never knew where she was adopted by a Jewish family and raised a Jewish princess. She had the charmed life. And I just laughed and I said, well, you're going to find out you were raised Southern Baptist. You were born Southern Baptist, not Jewish. And she did. She really did. She was from Chattanooga. And the stories we find are so different from what you expect. By the time that I did my DNA, I had already met my mother and her family. And I found out by getting my records that my father had been murdered. That's how I found out about him. There's a picture out there on my storyboard of my father. But you find the whole story. And people will call me and say, well, I'm a Tennessee Children's Home child. And those are the ones that I work with from Memphis. And I was born in Knoxville. Well, that's really interesting because the Tennessee Children's Home operated 4 sites in Tennessee. One in Nashville, one in Chattanooga, one in Knoxville, and one in Memphis. The only one that was criminal was the one in Memphis. So if you tell me you were born in Knoxville and you were adopted in Knoxville, chances are you're not a Georgetown baby. And all of your records are right there in Knoxville. That's going to be easy for you to find. And I can tell them how to find them. One woman, I could even find her whole story within 15 minutes. But I do work primarily with the Tennessee Children's Home children. So if you know anybody that's looking, tell them to call me. You can get my number from LaDonna, and I'll work with them or their siblings. But now I'm working with a whole bunch now and they're all children of the adoptees, which is very, very interesting. It's good to know that the children are interested and the story goes forward. I have found that men are less receptive to finding their families. They don't want to know unless they're really pulled into it by their families. It's just a thing with men. They get very angry, and if they go into a good home, they're very loyal to their good home. And because an adoptee wants to open her records does not mean she's not loyal to the people that adopted her and gave her a home. My mom and my dad were the people that adopted me, not the people that gave birth to me. But I still needed to find, what's my family roots? Did my parents come over on the Mayflower? Or were, they somewhere, where'd that come from? What did my ancestors do? And some people have just had wonderful, wonderful stories that they've found, and they're so happy. Are there any questions or things I haven't answered that you might want to know? If you do, come down to the microphone, and I'll be happy to answer questions for you. Oh, come on. Some of you have questions. I know you do. None. You're the first group where I had no questions. Well, how would you like to have had your life end up in an orphanage like that? Can you imagine what your life would have been like?
We do have a question. You're not able to name you.
Okay.
We were just sitting here wondering, what happened to her money, Georgia Ann's money? What happened to it?
Well, it's really interesting. Lately, I've gotten a copy of her will. And everybody in Memphis knew that she was so devoted to the children's home, such a lovely woman. And but when she found out she had cancer, she had Abe Waldauer fill out her will, in which she left nothing to the children's home. She had a daughter that she adopted, and she had a 20-year-old woman that she adopted. There's some questions as to the relationship with the 20-year-old, but she wanted to make her have legal rights or something. But anyway, so she adopted her, and then she adopted another child. The other child, as far as I know, may still be alive, but they say that she didn't get anything. They never found any of the money. I think in the year that she knew she was going to die, she hid it. So, nobody really knows. When I was doing a group in Florence, Alabama, Lisa and Judy Christie and I were going to speak, and we were coming from the book signing of Before and After in Memphis, and I got to the venue before they did. So I'd driven for a couple hours, and I was tired of sitting, so I got a cup of punch, and I was standing at a table, and a woman came up to us. And nobody knew that I was the speaker. So I was just standing there asking, did you read the book? What'd you think about it? That kind of thing. And I liked it. And this woman said, well, I used to work in that building on Poplar Avenue. And I thought, oh, okay. And I said, when did you work there? And she said, about 54. And I thought, oh, well, that's 4 years after Georgia died. They rented it out to the Girl Scouts. So she was probably working for the Girl Scouts. And she said, there was a room upstairs in that house that was padlocked. And she said, we weren't allowed to go in there. And every now and then somebody would come to the door and say they needed their records. And somebody would be with them, and they'd go upstairs and open that door. And she said you could peek inside and see, and it was floor to ceiling in boxes. And that must have been the records. And she said, when we left there, that room was still padlocked. So I don't know, and I don't know that anybody else knows what happened to those records. Maybe that's what the state has now that they're giving out, because they go by the number. When you request your records, you give them your adoptive name, you give them your name and your adoptive name and your date of birth, and they go from there, so they have a way of accessing what's what in those records. But I'm amazed at what comes out of the records. In mine, for instance, because my mother applied for welfare, there was a copy of her intake form in my records. So, I knew, and the social worker in that part of the county had really done her work. So the work was not done by Georgia Tan, it was done by the little social workers that were trying to do a good job throughout the state. It's just when Georgia got them that things became criminal. Anybody else?
Can you describe the house, like the orphanage house, and is it still operable today?
It is not there anymore. It was there for a while, and then it became a couple of different kind of industrial type businesses, but they tore it down. And they dug up the yard, and they found some bodies out in the backyard. That's how they found some of the graves. But they don't know whether the rest of the graves were maybe in her place in Mississippi or fed to the alligators in the Mississippi River. Who knows? But the house, when you go out in the lobby, there's a picture of the house there. And it was two-story house. And upstairs, if you look, there's 3 little booklets on the table that are every year around Christmas time, Georgia Tan would run ads in the newspaper saying, "You can have a baby for Christmas. You might give your best friend a sweater for Christmas, but she'd say, give your best friend a baby for Christmas." And she would run these in the newspaper, and people all over the country would see these, and they'd call her up and say, "Well, I want that little boy." And if the little boy was available, she'd sell him that one. But if he wasn't, she'd say, "Well, tell me what you're looking for." And she sort of specialized in blonde hair, blue-eyed children. She wanted the pretty babies. And but if you were looking for a dark-haired child, or if you were Jewish, then the child she was going to send you was going to be Jewish, or their daddy was going to be a wealthy doctor in medical school, and their mother was going to suddenly become a concert pianist. If you remember Before We Were Yours, the little girl that went to the family that was a concert pianist. All of that was taken out of the newspaper articles from the library. One question I get asked a lot is, how did Lisa write that book? How did she settle on that story? And it's really interesting. Lisa, if she was here, would tell you, she was up late one night watching TV, and she kind of had writer's block. And she said it was so late that even her dog had gone to bed. And she was watching this TV show, and it was called The 10 Deadliest Women in America. And I understand that has run recently on television somewhere. I didn't see it, but it has been rerun. And one of the women in that show was Georgia Tan. And Lisa just got so involved in looking at that, she thought, I can write that story. And so she took off and went to do that. And everything that she pulled out is factual. And like I said, now she knows the people that she was writing about, which is interesting for her. And she stays very much involved in the story, even though she's gone on to write other books. And she was very ill last year with the coronavirus. So we were real worried about her. She spent about a year getting over it, but she finally did get over it. But she does that with all of her books. She's written 30 books. I invite you to read more of them. My favorite, my personal favorite, is Tending Roses, which was one of her first books, and it's about her grandmother. And the full part of the story is the things her grandmother taught her that maybe you wished your grandmother had taught you, or she did teach you. And I read it 2 or 3 times, and then finally the last time I read it with a paper and pencil, writing down all the things that I wished I had learned from my grandmother. So I invite you to read that book. That's really good. Her new one is the Book of Lost Friends. Came out last year, and it's about after the Civil War, the slaves looking for their families that had been the freed slaves, and most of them couldn't read or write, and all they knew is their story. And they would publish in a listing called The List of Lost Friends. And for 50 cents, they could run an ad saying, my name was Lula Mae, and I belonged to Farmer Jones, and he sold me to Farmer Roberts down the road, and he had this many slaves, and they moved off to Texas, and I'm looking for my mama and my daddy and my 7 brothers. And if you know where any of them are, have them contact me, and people would contact them, and that's how they would find their families. And it's a really good book. It's based on real, actual letters from the List of Lost Friends. Well, I guess that's what I've got. If you don't have any more questions, okay?
When we selected Before We Were Yours as our common read novel, one of the connections that we talked about was the modern connection with human trafficking today. And you'd mentioned just a little bit that, this was in some ways the earliest, one of the earliest
Not
cases.
the earliest.
Well, right, but one of, at
One
least
of
on
their-
the national
Uh-huh.
conscience, I guess. But what connections do you kind of see with the stories in Before We Were Yours, and then your own story, and then kind of the modern understanding of human trafficking?
Well, human trafficking is still going on. There are stories still of people doing this kind of thing, of selling babies. I got a thing from it must be this month's New Yorker magazine. There's a story of a woman that's doing it now. And there was a doctor in the 50s that after she died that was doing it out of North Georgia. So, if there's money to be made, there are people that'll make it. So that's it. Just be aware. One thing we didn't cover is the cost. When you think about what they were willing to pay for us then and what people are buying children for now, you think it's a lot of money, but it's really not. In $1,000 in '49 was a quarter of the value of their home. So you look at the price of homes now, and a quarter of that value is about what people are paying now to get children. Well, thank you for coming today, and I invite you to look at the display outside, and I appreciate you being here.
Thank y'all for coming. You're dismissed.